What is falsafa, and how did it first develop in the Islamic world? What were its questions and concerns? What was the House of Wisdom? Who was Al-Kindi, and what did he work on? Define Aql, Burhan, and Nafs. Who was Al-Farabi, and what did he work on? What was his virtuous city? We mentioned previously that one of the defining features of medieval Islam was the turn to books and literacy. With the introduction of the Chinese invention of paper in the late 8th century, the creation of an Islamic book culture was well underway. While the Arabic language had had a long history of oral performances, like the Quran and of course the famous Arabic poetry, the Arabic language was not yet equipped to be a language of education and literature. Most human languages aren't. To create a vast amount of literature in a given language, not only do you need the technologies of actual bookmaking, the language in question has to be turned into a literary language. For example, if you want to write a science book in a language in which science books have never been written, you're going to have to introduce a whole lot of words and concepts to this new language. That's why, for instance, in English, so many of our technical words for the sciences come from Greek and, to a lesser extent, Latin. English wasn't always a scientific language, and so in order to make it a scientific language, people had to import words and thoughts from older languages that people already wrote science books in. Think how hard it would be to do science in English without Greek notions like physics, physis, the course of nature, biology, biologia, the logical discourse of living things, or astronomy, astronomoi, the laws of the stars. Well, a similar process happened in the Arabic language centuries before English. There were already other ancient literatures written in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Persian, Sanskrit, and several other languages. But as Arabic was now the official language of the Abbasid government, and it was more commonly spoken, Arabic would have to be turned into a receptacle for all this ancient writing. Arabic would have to turn into a language of high literature, science, history, medicine, and statecraft. And in turn, the developments of all these fields by Arabic speakers, both Arabs and people who spoke Arabic as a second language, would change the course of the humanities and the sciences forever, even well beyond the Islamic world. Like rulers in affluent moments of history are wont to do, the caliphs patronized and sometimes commissioned important texts to be translated into Arabic. This happened a little bit already in the Umayyad period with some medical manuals. But in the Abbasid period, aided by the introduction of paper, the translation of books from a variety of languages into Arabic really took off. Under the reign of Al-Mansur, the second Abbasid caliph, we see the appearance in Arabic of Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, that's the book that outlines how to apply scientific methods, and the Categories, Aristotle's treatise on how to divide out the natural world into classes like substances, qualities, or locations. Also under Mansur, there was the first Arabic translation of the ISUII011 of Porphyry. That's the book that explains how the natural world is divided into genuses and species. Well, these are the kinds of texts that you need to have in your library if you want to do hard sciences, logic, or the social sciences. Al-Mansur also introduced something else into the Abbasid world that would completely reshape the Ummah, as well as human knowledge as a whole. He made a new Abbasid capital. In the year 762, Mansur created a new city located between the Arab and Persian halves of his empire on the site of a small village along the Tigris River in Iraq. There, the Abbasid caliphs would rule for centuries to come, simultaneously distant from the borders of their empire, and so safe from invasion, and yet centrally located within that empire, so that messages, troops, and trade could all move through the capital city. This new capital was called the Medinat as-Salam, the City of Peace. We today call it Baghdad. And it would quickly become one of the largest, wealthiest, and most influential cities in world history. Within this capital, al-Mansur commissioned a book repository. This was the Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. When this House of Wisdom was founded, it was functionally just the caliph's private library. But it quickly evolved into something much, much more. The House of Wisdom would be a center where all of the literatures from this empire would be gathered, translated into Arabic, edited, and studied. Sanskrit books from India, Pahlavi books from Persia, Syriac books from the Levant, and Greek books from the Mediterranean. Like many rivers converging at a pool, the knowledge and research of nearly half of the human race would meet together in the city of Baghdad and be moved into the Arabic language. And so, if you could read Arabic, you suddenly have access to everything. And this process created a feedback loop. The more Arabic became the receptacle of all this ancient knowledge, the more Arabic became the language of new knowledge. Within a century, Arabic flipped from being a minor regional language of the Arabs to the language of the educated elite, from Central Europe to the edges of China, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Central Caucasus. Whether you were Egyptian or Syrian, Persian or Indian, if you knew Arabic, you could learn about medicine, history, mathematics, poetry, biology, political science, art, and engineering. And the more the House of Wisdom moved books into Arabic, the more Arabic became a language of education. And the more Arabic became a language of education, the more original books were written in Arabic. And so pretty quickly, there was an explosion of both new translations and original Arabic works appearing throughout the Abbasid Empire, not just at the House of Wisdom. More books created more authors, and more authors create more books. And so the question presents itself. What does all of this different human knowledge, newly combined and made accessible in Arabic, have to do with Islam? What do all of these books written by people have to do with the God who writes the Quran? The Arabic speakers called this study falsafa, using a loanword from the Greek, philosophia, the love of wisdom. Related to the English word philosophy, falsafa would likewise contain within itself the studies of ethics, logic, and metaphysics. But unlike our word philosophy, falsafa also included the social and material sciences. Any discipline that required the use of reason, that is, aql in Arabic, the human mind's ability to detect systems and patterns in the world and in itself. Reason dictates that the world works in regular ways, and therefore the ways the world works are predictable. If things worked in certain ways in the past, they would presumably work the same way in the future. The use of human reason demands this, and that is why, when we use our reason, we can have knowledge of things that we can't see or things that haven't happened yet. Falsafa, medieval Islamic philosophy, was any rational discipline, any attempt of the human mind to use their reason to uncover the ways the world worked. Coming out of early Kalam, notably the Mutazilites, Islam already contained within itself a notion of how all of the world's functionings spread from a single predictable source. This is Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God. God is one, all-powerful, all-knowing, and beyond time, form, and change. And yet, this God is also the maker and sustainer of the whole universe. So, Tawhid says that the entire world has just one source, and that governs everything at all times. And that source never, ever changes. And that's just the kind of thing you need if you want to use your reason to do any kind of logic or sciences. If you want to use your reason, you have to start with the premise that the world works in a rational way. And so, it seems, if God is absolutely one, Tawhid, and human reason can detect the patterns of the universe, human reason ought to be able to understand the workings of God. In fact, in a certain way, the human ability to reason must, in truth, be the human ability to understand the way God does things. That deep awareness that we all possess, that the world around us functions in a regular, predictable way, is evidence that the world has a regular, perfectly predictable designer. Now, while some Muslims, like the Ash'arites, concluded bila kayf, that reason can't really grasp the divine, the Muslim philosophers concluded just the opposite. Reason by its very nature is the human ability to understand the divine. And so the question of early Islamic falsafa would be about how to syncretize revelation, like the Quran, and what reason tells us. If God is one and never changes, then Islam and human reason must be in perfect agreement. The only question is how. Probably the first Muslim to take up this line of thinking was the Kufan philosopher Abu Yusuf ibn Ishaq al-Kindi. Himself one of the editors who moved Greek texts into Arabic, al-Kindi knew these books very well, and he became the author of over 200 treatises and books of his own. Al-Kindi wrote on musical theory, meteorology, internal medicine, optics, astronomy, and cryptography. But underneath all of this was al-Kindi's philosophy that he laid out in his book, ISUII011, on first philosophy. He starts with something he learned from Aristotle's posterior analytics. There is a fixed, scientific method that you need if you want to show that something is correct. This is what al-Kindi called burhan, demonstrability. Something is demonstrable, and therefore correct, if you can show it again and again in a controlled environment. In other words, every time you run an experiment, you should get the same results. As long as you control for all factors, the world works in a regular, demonstrable way. Al-Kindi would apply this knowledge about burhan, demonstrability, to every kind of human knowledge that he could, including Islamic knowledge. Because of Tawhid, the unity of God, and therefore the regularity of the world God made, there can't be any contradictions between what falsafa, the use of reason, says, and what the Quran says. If there does seem to be a contradiction, it's the job of the Muslim philosopher to correct any discrepancy. Sometimes reason has to give way to revelation, and other times revelation can only be explained by reason. Here are two examples that al-Kindi struggled with. The first was about the nature of the soul. While the Quran indirectly suggests that humans have something inside of themselves that survives death, the Quran never really presents an argument about the soul. And it wouldn't, because the notion of the soul, the psyche, is a Greek idea. Now, today it's routinely fused into Jewish, Christian, and Islamic religious thought, but neither the Quran nor the Bible present dead people's souls acting without their bodies. But Muslims, as well as Jews and Christians, would come to incorporate the ancient Greek notion of the soul into their own traditions, because it could be used to explain quite a bit. Keeping with an Islamic example here, the Quran makes it clear that something inside of us existed even before we were born. There are Quranic passages in which the entire human race is shown to be inherent in Adam, the first human at the beginning of time. And something like this will continue to exist after we die. So when we are resurrected from the dead, something must be added to our remains that reanimates them. That is, there's something about us that isn't our bodies, something that existed before our bodies existed and still exists after our bodies are dead. Take a look at this Quranic passage. It is God that takes the self at death. The word here, nafs, literally just means self. It's the thing that makes us, us. But normally, when you think of yourself, you're talking about you living in your body right now. But here in the Quran, this self can be taken from you at your death by God, and perhaps spatially? So it isn't the same as your body, because it seems to be taken somewhere else. That is, if you use this Greek notion of the soul, you can explain what the Quran is talking about here. So when the Quran talks about your nafs, yourself, this is functionally the same as the Greek notion of the soul. Our true self, the thing that makes us us, must be an animating force that survives death. And conversely, because the nafs, when viewed as a soul, can animate things that aren't alive, this philosophical reading of the Quran can explain the resurrection from the dead at the end of time. Al-Kindi can therefore conclude that the Islamic doctrine of resurrection after death is in fact compatible with Greek-styled reason. It's possible to have a self without a body, and then use that bodiless self to bring dead matter back to life. And sometimes Al-Kindi concludes the other way around, that the Quran must bow to reason. He discusses the issue of how God created the world. According to multiple passages in the Quran, God made the world over a course of 6 days at the beginning of time. But then we have to ask, how can God start making the world at a particular point in time, when God doesn't exist in time and so can't start or stop doing anything? In this case, Al-Kindi concludes that we cannot read Quranic accounts of creation literally. Instead, he sides with Greek Neoplatonic philosophers who argue that time stretches backwards infinitely and that the only thing outside of time is true nothingness. Since creation is, by definition, somethingness, and time itself is a creation, the creation of the world by God must have come out of nothing, not out of something. The world began outside of time and beyond matter. And so when we look to the Quran, and God says he makes the world in 6 days, the Muslim has to interpret this as a metaphor. The process of moving Greek philosophical thought into Arabic, and from there developing new falsafa, continued long after Al-Kindi. Working 2 generations after him was Abu Nasr al-Farabi. Al-Farabi was born in what is today Kazakhstan, but like Al-Kindi before him and so many other people that we're going to be meeting, he felt the strong pull to come to the new capital of Baghdad, with all of its promises of literature, learning, culture, and science. Just something to keep an eye on, by the way. Another of the definitive features of the Islamic Middle Ages is that all roads lead to Baghdad. Farabi's fame as a commentator on Greek science and logic would earn him the title of the second teacher, with the first teacher being Aristotle, the ancient Greek progenitor of so many of the sciences that we still use to this day. And so if Aristotle was the first teacher, Farabi was the second teacher, because he moved a great deal of Aristotelian logic and science into Arabic, making it much more widely available, while also adding hundreds of his own contributions. Farabi was the author of many works on logic, music, and chemistry, but his most famous project was an analysis of the Medina al-Fadila, the virtuous city. It goes like this. You start with Plato, the ancient Greek author of the Republic. In the Republic, Plato suggests that there is a direct correlation between the mind of the individual and the larger political system that individual lives in. Basically, that governments reflect the attributes of their people, while people project their values and vices out onto their governments. Therefore, Plato recommended that teaching people to be rational would lead to rational forms of government. At the top of Plato's ideal government was the philosopher king, a ruler perfectly in step with the people, because he governed based on rationality and the laws of the universe. Then Farabi turns to Aristotle. In the Physics, Aristotle argues that change and time are substances that entirely permeate the universe. Since everything in the world as we know it changes and passes through time, the initial cause of everything that exists must be something outside of time and beyond change. This accounts for the regularity of the natural world and for the ability of humans to use their intellect, since both the reason and the regular movement of nature demand a singular cause outside of time. Farabi, like most Muslim, Jewish, and Christian readers of Aristotle, would consider this first cause to be God. Now, Farabi, being a Muslim, already has a notion that there's an eternal God. And furthermore, Islam has built into it a relationship between the timeless divinity and the temporal human mind. This is prophecy. A prophet is a mortal human being who lives and dies and passes through time, who can somehow comprehend something of God. Farabi thought that the key to understanding how this was possible was through the aql, through human reason. Humans, via their reason, are uniquely equipped to understand the universe through science, and God through religion, because reason, nature, and God all follow the same fixed patterns. Because God is one, and God makes both nature and reason must also function as singularities. Now, when a Muslim says that someone is a prophet, what that means, according to Farabi, is that their reason is particularly well attuned. So basically, the reason of a prophet, unlike a normal person, can just access God directly. Oh, and by the way, Farabi was a Shiite, so he would also include the imams in this category of people with perfected reasons as well. Now Farabi has to put all these pieces together. Islam, as he interprets it, says that prophets and imams are people in best accord with God. Aristotle says that this is because there's a direct correlation between reason and the first cause, God. And Plato says that there's a direct relationship between the actions of a single human and the actions of a whole group, that thing that we call politics. And so, if you want to build a perfect society, its government must mirror the shape and rational functioning of the universe and its God. And guess what? According to Farabi, Islam is uniquely equipped to do this, because what did its prophet Muhammad do? Well, he founded a city with a novel form of government. So there's a historical model of how a rational system of government is to work. And there is demonstrable philosophical proof that this system can be recreated by the personal use of reason. That is, while there are no more prophets to directly govern us, the prophets don't have any powers that all other humans don't have too. Prophets are just those people who have remarkably well-functioning reason. But every human being has the ability to reason to some extent. So, for instance, when a typical human performs a scientific experiment, or makes an observation about how the world works, that person just accessed something of how God works through the use of reason. So reason is only different from prophecy in degree. Farabi recognizes that we would be very hard-pressed to find someone as gifted as a prophet or an imam to govern a virtuous city. But he also concludes that we don't have to. The skills and aptitudes that the prophets and imams have are available in lesser ways to other people. For instance, Farabi says that an ideal ruler should be intelligent, have a good memory, speak well, not be overly concerned with wealth, food, drinking, or sexuality, and should have a deep-seated hatred for corruption and oppression. Basically, an ideal ruler should be a perfect human being, someone who can naturally grasp and follow the will of God. Muhammad and the Imams would have qualified, but very few others. But instead, Farabi concludes, we can divvy up the leadership of this virtuous city into a ruling council, each of whom has some particularly well-developed philosophical gift. That is, none of the gifts that the prophets and the Imams had, intelligence, divine intuition, compassion, self-control, and so on, are absolutely unique to them. They just have them in uncommon abundance. So instead, Farabi's virtuous city can create a ruling council, basically a limited republic, by finding individuals with just some of these gifts and having them rule together as a group. So you don't need one perfect ruler with all of these attributes. You just need all of these attributes. So find one person who's extremely compassionate, and another person who's very gifted at speech and memory, another who's remarkably brilliant, and so on. This way, the virtuous city of Farabi's imagination can mimic the city of Muhammad, where people and God lived in immediate harmony. Now, notice what Farabi just did to prophecy here. According to him, prophecy isn't really a miraculous power. Prophecy is just another way of saying an extremely gifted intellect. The way philosophers reason and the way prophets or imams reveal divine wisdom is functionally the same. Philosophers, prophets, and imams all have the ability to use their minds to uncover the hidden secrets of the universe and the one reality that governs it. But then, doesn't that mean that philosophy and Islam are just the same thing? If the books that the philosophers write and the books that the prophets bring are from the same source, and those books agree with each other, well then, what's so special about prophets? Next time, we're going to delve more into this problem that's inherent in so much Islamic philosophy. What's the point of revealed religion if you have human reason? What is falsafa, and how did it first develop in the Islamic world? What were its questions and concerns? What was the House of Wisdom? Who was Al-Kindi, and what did he work on? Define Aql, Burhan, and Nafs. Who was Al-Farabi, and what did he work on? What was his virtuous city?